June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean glistened under the morning sun, calm and deceptively peaceful. On the horizon, the Japanese carrier Akagi cut through the waves, its decks alive with motion. Pilots checking engines, sailors wheeling bombs, officers barking orders for the next strike. This was Japan's pride, the flagship that had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet, just 6 months later, the hunter was about to become the hunted. Then, shadows fell. From the Legacies, American dive bombers folded their wings into a death dive. Their engines screamed like banshees as anti-aircraft guns roared in response. Black flak bursts dotted the heavens, but the attackers kept coming. At exactly 10:26 a.m., a single 1,000-pound bomb tore through Akagi's flight deck. It plunged into the hangar, igniting fuel lines and torpedoes waiting below. In seconds, the carrier became an inferno. Steel groaned, flames leapt skyward, and men fled through choking smoke. The ship that symbolized Japan's naval dominance was doomed in minutes. But how could such a mighty warship, once untouchable, collapse so quickly? And what fatal chain of choices led to this moment? On the bridge of Akagi stood Captain Taijiro Aoki, a seasoned officer with calm eyes that belied the storm brewing inside him. At 51, Aoki was no stranger to war. He had overseen Akagi since before Pearl Harbor, had tasted the thrill of victory, and now carried the burden of defending Japan's empire. The morning of June 4th tested every nerve. Reports had flooded in, American carriers spotted, squadrons inbound. Aoki's crew worked feverishly, arming planes for a counterstrike. The hangars below were crowded with aircraft being rearmed, their fuel tanks refilled, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck. Amid the chaos, a young sailor, barely 20, paused for breath. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the metallic smell of aviation fuel stinging his nose. He glanced upward. The skies seemed endless, but his gut tightened as if danger lurked just beyond the horizon. For Aoki, every decision carried weight. Should he launch immediately, or wait to strike with overwhelming force? Hesitation could be fatal. His flagship balanced on the edge of destiny. Somewhere beyond sight, American bombers were closing in, and Aoki had no idea how little time remained. High above the Pacific, the men of the U.S. Navy's dive bomber squadrons tightened their grips on the controls. Flying in from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, these aviators carried the weight of the Pacific War on their shoulders. At their head was Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who had led his squadrons on a desperate search for the Japanese fleet. By sheer luck and instinct, he had found them. Below, spread across the blue ocean, lay the heart of Japan's carrier force, Kega, Soryu, and Akagi. One of the bombers carried Lieutenant Richard Best, a calm, determined man. As he dove, the world around him narrowed to a single target, Akagi. Through his sights, he saw the deck cluttered with aircraft, bombs, and fuel. A golden opportunity, yet one that meant plunging into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. The dive began. The SBD Dauntless screamed downward, engines howling, the ocean rushing closer. Flak bursts rattled the planes. Pilots clenched their teeth, fighting the stick against gravity's pull. This was the strike that could decide the fate of the Pacific. Though the Akagi carried the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, she was no invincible fortress. Her very design carried hidden flaws. Originally a battlecruiser converted into a carrier, she bore compromises: thin armor, poor ventilation, and limited fire suppression. By June 4th, with bombs and fuel scattered across crowded hangars, she was a floating powder keg. Earlier that morning, Akagi's squadrons had struck Midway Island, leaving fires smoldering across the atoll. But as reconnaissance reports trickled in, Captain Aoki faced a dilemma. American carriers had been sighted. Should he launch another wave at Midway or rearm for a carrier duel? Orders shifted back and forth. Bombs were rolled out and then dragged back. Torpedoes readied, then replaced with high explosives. The hangar became a warehouse of confusion. Planes crowded wingtip to wingtip. Every minute wasted left Akagi more vulnerable. At 10:20 a.m., the first attackers came low. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet. 15 lumbering devastators skimmed the waves, slow and unarmored. Japanese Zeros pounced, cutting them down mercilessly. One by one, the American torpedo bombers burst into flames or cartwheeled into the sea. Only one pilot from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 strike survived. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. The Zeros had been pulled low, chasing torpedo bombers at wave-top height. Above, the skies opened. From 15,000 feet, McCluskey's SBD Dauntless dive bombers folded their wings and plunged. Lieutenant Richard Best locked his sights on Akagi. He saw chaos below, planes armed and lined for launch, bombs scattered, fuel glistening across the deck. He exhaled, steadied his hand, and released. The explosion touched off aviation fuel. Fire roared through the lower decks, igniting torpedoes stored carelessly in the corners. In seconds, secondary explosions rippled through the ship. Flames shot skyward. Black smoke curled and darkened the noon sun. Sailors were hurled from their stations. Men screamed as fire swallowed compartments. On the bridge, Aoki staggered as the ship shuddered beneath him. He barked orders to fight the flames, but the inferno spread faster than hoses could reach. The carrier's heart had been pierced. Akagi's fate was sealed in minutes. From a historian's view, the Battle of Midway turned not on sheer numbers, but on a razor-thin sequence of decisions and luck. For Japan, the fatal error was timing. Admiral Nagumo had kept his carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in a vulnerable posture, caught between rearming for Midway and preparing to strike American carriers. In that confusion, their decks became cluttered with bombs, fuel, and half-prepared planes. A disaster waiting to ignite. On the American side, courage fused with fortune. The doomed torpedo squadrons, annihilated at sea level, had unknowingly cleared the skies above. Japanese Zeros chased low, leaving their carriers exposed. At that precise moment, McCluskey's dive bombers arrived overhead. The result, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, struck within minutes. A once dominant fleet crippled before lunch. The lesson was brutal and clear. Carriers, unlike battleships, could be lost in moments if caught unprepared. Naval warfare had shifted forever, from big guns to air wings, from armor to vigilance. But for the men aboard Akagi, this was no lesson in theory. It was survival against a firestorm. On the lower deck, the young sailor who had smelled fuel earlier now ran through smoke-filled corridors. He coughed, eyes burning, searching for an exit. Around him, comrades stumbled blindly, some already overcome. The fire advanced like a living beast, devouring steel and flesh alike. On the bridge, Captain Aoki clutched the rail. His ship was dying beneath him. He had devoted years to Akagi, had watched her strike Pearl Harbor in glory. Now, to see her crippled in minutes, it was unbearable. Yet he barked orders with steady voice, refusing to abandon hope even as the inferno spread. Far above, Richard Best pulled away from his dive, heart pounding. He glanced back at the towering pillar of fire rising from Akagi. Victory should have tasted sweet. Instead, he felt a heavy silence inside. He had ended hundreds of lives with a single release. The fumes he inhaled would scar his lungs and end his career. 2 men, 2 enemies, 1 ship burning between them. By noon on June 4th, Akagi was no longer a warship, but a burning hulk adrift on the Pacific. Her engines were silent, her decks collapsed inward, her hangars raging with fire. Sailors fought bravely, but every explosion pushed them further toward despair. Captain Aoki, wounded yet unyielding, finally accepted the inevitable. He ordered abandoned ship. Hundreds leapt into the oily sea, clinging to debris as the once mighty flagship blazed behind them. Of the crew, nearly 267 men perished that day, though many more would die in the waters that swallowed them. Admiral Nagumo, seeing his flagship beyond salvation, gave the grim order, "Scuttle her." Japanese destroyers circled, firing torpedoes into Akagi's side. The carrier shuddered once more, then began her slow death plunge. At 5:20 a.m. on June 5th, Akagi slipped beneath the waves, consumed by the sea she had once ruled. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point. In 24 hours, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, along with hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Imperial Navy, once feared as unstoppable, was gutted at its core. The loss of Akagi struck hardest. She had been the pride of the Kido Butai, the spearhead of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of Japanese naval dominance. Her sinking was not only material, it was psychological. For the first time, the Japanese public learned that their navy could bleed, and bleed catastrophically. For America, the battle was a miracle. Outnumbered, battered, and desperate, the U.S. Navy had delivered a decisive blow. Midway shifted the initiative. Never again would Japan launch a major offensive across the Pacific. From this point forward, the Allies advanced, island by island, driving Japan back toward its home waters. Strategically, Midway proved the supremacy of carriers over battleships. One well-placed bomb could decide the fate of a fleet. It reshaped naval doctrine forever. When Akagi's flames finally dimmed beneath the waves, the stories of her men lived on in stark contrast. Captain Taijiro Aoki survived. Though wounded, he was rescued from the sea. Yet survival brought no comfort. For the rest of his life, Aoki carried the shame of losing Japan's flagship under his command. His name, once tied to Pearl Harbor's triumph, became forever bound to Midway's disaster. The young sailor never escaped. His fate was sealed in the inferno. In later accounts, shipmates recalled only fragments, his helmet charred and drifting, a mute reminder of lives cut short. He represents the silent majority of war, men with no statues, no headlines, remembered only as numbers in casualty lists, yet each carrying a life, a family, a future lost. On the opposite side, Lieutenant Richard Best limped away from the battle victorious, yet broken. Midway would be his final mission. He would never fly in combat again. But in those few minutes, he had changed the war, delivering the strike that doomed Akagi and crippled Japan's ambitions. His legacy endured, though the cost was deeply personal. 3 men, 3 fates, 1 ship binding them together in triumph, shame, and death. The sinking of Akagi was more than the loss of a carrier. It was the collapse of Japan's dream of naval supremacy. In minutes, the ship that had once spearheaded Pearl Harbor was reduced to wreckage, her crew scattered across the sea. Midway proved that even the mightiest fleet could fall in a heartbeat. From that day forward, America no longer fought for survival, it fought for victory. And the Empire of Japan, once triumphant, began its long retreat across the Pacific. History remembers Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War. But Akagi's fiery end also reminds us of the thin line between glory and ruin, between dominance and disaster. So we ask you, what if Akagi had survived that morning? Could Japan have turned the tide, or was her fate sealed from the start? Many of you may have grown up hearing stories of Midway from veterans or family. What do you remember from those accounts? If you found this story powerful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. More untold battles and forgotten voices of World War II await.